Well,
So
thank you very much again for joining us this evening. Lovely to see so many of you on the call again. We're still letting people in, so we'll carry on doing that behind the scenes. Tonight is the second in our series of the Tablet Summer School 2024. I'm Amanda Davison-Young. I'm the CEO of the Tablet, and I'm joined this evening by our host, who's going to host all of these sessions, and it's really fantastic to have us with us. It's Professor Anna Rowlands, St Hilda's Professor of Catholic Social Thought and Practice. So we're absolutely delighted to have Anna and our speakers with us tonight. Each speaker is going to talk for about 10 minutes. They may reference CST, obviously that's Catholic Social Teaching. So if they do mention CST, that's what they're saying. We did have some queries last week, so I thought I'd just point that out. I'll run the chat box as well, so if you've got any questions as we're going through, then please do put them in the chat, but please remember that this is all recorded. So if you want to re-look at the webinar later on after this evening, then just drop me an email and we can send that to you. So less of me, more of the speakers and Anna. I'll hand over to Anna. Many thanks, Anna.
Thank you, Amanda. Thank you all for giving up your evening, whether it's cold and drizzly where you are or slightly sort of muggy and cloudy where I am in Oxford this evening. But you're all very welcome. We're very glad to have you along. Particular welcome to our three speakers for this evening, and a slight northern bias in our speakers this evening, which is accidental. I mean, I'm secretly as a Mancunian delighted by this, but it is in fact accidental. It's not a sort of preferential option for the north. Last time, it doesn't matter if you weren't with us last time, but just to sort of run through the seminar series as it's happening, the webinar series at the moment. So we began with a seminar last week on the common good. And this week we're moving on to talk about poverty. And that's quite a natural movement, as it were, for Catholic social teaching. If you are bored enough to need to read the compendium of the social doctrine of the Church, it begins with the common good as the first principle. And then, in fact, it moves on to talk about the universal destination of goods. That's not a phrase that trips off the tongue so lightly, but it's hugely important. It's the principle that teaches that God intends the goods of creation to meet the needs of all people and of the whole created order. And any failure for the goods of the earth to meet the needs of all people is a matter of human injustice, but it also suggests a relationship with the divine that's out of kilter. So it's a theological matter as well as a social and economic matter. And we live in an age now where we know that there are vast inequalities globally and also within our neighbourhoods and local communities. But we also know that poverty is not just a material question. It is that, but it's also a poverty of isolation, loneliness, of increased anxiety, and other forms of mental health challenges in the world that we live in now. So we know that these multiple faces of poverty intersect in our worlds. We also know that looking at poverty from a theological point of view also makes a further difference, which is that we're called to see those who are poorest and most marginalised as protagonists, as agents in their own stories, not as mere recipients of charity. This isn't about a transactional relationship around poverty. This is a reality in which we're called to recognise the poorest as protagonists in their own stories and as those chosen preferentially by God, if we read our scriptures carefully. So that's just a little bit of a sort of brief framework introduction to thinking about the issue of poverty in 2024, which is our focus for this evening. And without further ado, I'm going to introduce our first speaker for this evening, who will be known to many of you. It's Jenny Sinclair. So I'm just going to give a very short bio introduction to Jenny, and then I'll hand over to her. So Jenny is the founder and director of Together for the Common Good, a charity dedicated to spiritual and civic renewal. She works with leaders, churches, charities and schools, drawing on Catholic social teaching to help people build the common good in the places where they live and work. She's also the co-host of Leaving Egypt, a podcast, and she's a trustee of the Common Good Foundation and a member of the New Family and Society Committee at the Catholic Union. Together for the Common Good is a charity in association with Churches Together England and is also a member, which will be a theme for this evening, of the Caritas Social Action Network. So Jenny, you're really welcome and we're very much looking forward to hearing from you.
Thanks, Anna. Hello, everybody. Really nice to see you. I'm just going to give a very brief sketch of how CST helps me think about poverty and how it shapes my work at grassroots level and how it helps us build a path to civic and spiritual renewal. So the first thing that CST does for us is to help us understand the real world, the context that we're in. CST critiques any system that's dehumanizing and which centralizes too much power. And the principles of human dignity, solidarity, subsidiarity, and the preferential option for the poor help us read the economy in a particular way. So how does this help us now? Well, every era is characterized by a particular philosophy which shapes the political economy. And the animating idea of this era that we're in comes from the philosophy of liberalism, which has a view of the human being as the unencumbered self, where freedom is achieved by minimizing constraint. And this is quite different from a Christian anthropology in which we are relational beings made in the image of God. And in the last 40 years, this philosophy has morphed into neoliberalism, a belief that governments should serve the interests of global corporates who want to operate without constraint. And so we have an economy requiring units of labor to be cheap and mobile and the commodification of everything. This deeply affects people's lives. Jobs move to low-wage economies. The already wealthy get richer while whole sections of society get discarded. And we see the consequences in our post-industrial and coastal towns, for example. And CST shows us that this is a politics of abandonment. It's a breach of the common good. So we have this toxic cycle, a low-wage, high-welfare economy with increasingly precarious and meaningless jobs with wages too low to live on, subsidized by the public purse, making up the difference, causing massive debt. So this neoliberal system drives poverty in all its forms, not only economic, but also relational, spiritual, and moral. And we see it not only in increasing inequality and destitution, but also in symptoms of human distress. So its individualism dissolves relationships. It grooms us to outsource things to the market and state that we used to do together. So we see family breakdown, weakened communities, and loneliness on a vast scale, rises in addiction, self-harm, depression, and so on. So there's our context. This is the sea we swim in. This is what Pope Francis calls a malign culture. And it has this root cause. This philosophy must be addressed. And the symptoms are many. And so we really need to recognize that the complexities around poverty are many. It can't just be fixed with cash transfers. This CST analysis of the context helps to explain why the preferential option for the poor is central. It's also not because the poor need help. It's not just because the poor need help. If the strong are separated from the weak, the whole body gets out of balance. Think of the Corinthians one body image. So this reciprocity is at the heart of God's special love for the poor. Pope Francis says that the church needs to be evangelized by the poor because someone who is poor has a sense of their need for others and for God that the affluent and the busy so easily lose. They've not completely lost that sense of that kingdom instinct of needing others. Living on the hard edges of life reveals a wound that's invisible to the rest of society. And so we can't really appreciate this by hearing about it on a webinar or reading about it. It's only when we share life with poor communities that we see the way God sees. I know a woman, for example, who's been in terrible debt for 2 years. She told me she was in church every week, but she didn't tell a soul, and nobody asked. Now that church was poorer for its ignorance of her situation. A shared life would have provided a more accurate understanding of what's going on and an opportunity for connection. So we desperately need the church to build a common good with poor communities. But currently, it's not clear whose side the church is on. And it's important to remember that the Catholic understanding of equality, we're equal under God, but we're not meant to be equal or the same for a very good reason. We're meant to love each other. As Catherine of Siena said, discerning the mind of God, I've given many gifts and graces. I've given not everything to one single person so that you may be constrained to practice charity towards one another. So we're meant to be in relationship. Now, church leaders are always asking, how should the church respond to poverty and how can we engage better with poor communities? And to answer these questions, I always start with an honest conversation. I say, we've got to look at this through the lens of CST and we begin to see what's happening. There's been a tendency to outsource poverty work to professionals and volunteers, but Pope Francis is saying to us, it's personal. He's calling us to neighborliness and friendship. He's saying we must build a solidarity. There is also the problem of middle-class church. There are notable exceptions, but many churches have undergone a culture change and have fallen out of relationship with poor communities. There are clues, for example, in the language that's used around social action, language like outreach and service delivery. This is not the language of friendship and mutual respect. And sometimes in their efforts to serve, churches have inadvertently suffered mission drift and been influenced by a kind of NGO culture. Pope Francis again is saying it's got to be personal. This service provider mindset can often leave poor communities disempowered. And this is like a failure of subsidiarity. And it's misguided because what they really want is the dignity of work. So this kind of misunderstanding leads to a preference for campaigning and advocating for benefits rather than for jobs, which can alienate many working class communities who want to work. So they can often see the church as a woke food bank. This is a failure to grasp the Catholic tradition of justice in which the dignity of work is central. So the food bank paradox is a genuine dilemma. They've become a baked-in component in a toxic low-wage economy that props up big corporations. They meet essential and increasing need, but mask prophetic justice. The more efficient the emergency food aid becomes, the less urgent economic reform appears. So once church leaders engage with this kind of way of seeing things, I find that they say, okay, I get it. We need to make a shift, but where do we start? So where do we start? This culture shift that Pope Francis is asking for. Firstly, at national level, the church is called through advocacy to advocate economic reform with the dignity of work at its heart, which must be the cornerstone of common good politics. And the church should be calling for a proper industrial strategy targeted at our post-industrial and coastal towns, as well as the poor areas of our great cities. We've got to bring back capital into those areas. The overriding purpose is to engage wider participation in our national life, to reverse the situation where large numbers of people have been discarded. So this requires a political will, a will to reform the economy, but the scale of debt and the enslavement to vested interests means there's limited room for manoeuvre. And currently, this new government is making some promising noises, but we have to wait and see what they can do. Like their predecessors over 4 decades, they're still perpetuating the neoliberal economic model. And since the Blair years, we've been told there's no alternative, but it's not true. The system is inherently unstable and things can change. But also at the national level, we've got to think about other levels. Parish level. What I would say is needed, and I often say this to church leaders, is we need to make this shift from outsourcing to a sense of family. So there's a tendency to keep poor people at arm's length because a lot of people in parishes are actually afraid of dysfunctional families or complicated families in their neighbourhood. We need to ask ourselves, are we the kind of church that knows its own people? Are we confident to welcome an ex-offender and his family? Are we able to operate relationships of grace and truth? Do we know our neighbours well enough to say, well, we'll club together and help that family or give that person a decent burial? We can also shift our culture around the way we run food banks. So we can say they need to become places of encounter, not just service delivery. We could shift to social supermarkets, to pantries. We can say we can help people out of debt. Teaching cooking skills and budgeting skills is relational. It's more helpful in the long run than emergency food handouts. Of course, we have to do both, but we can make everything that we do relational. And becoming a church community like this needs to recognize complexity and brokenness. So I'm getting the 2-minute warning, so I need to move on. Local relationship building is absolutely fundamental. Relationships are of value in their own right, not just for co-opting people to a campaign. Francis is asking for a culture change. He's saying the church needs to be in relationship with the poor. And this is why he's calling for a culture of encounter. And the synodal practices are relevant here. They are to help us not only listen to the Holy Spirit within the parish, but especially listening in the neighbourhood. Pope Francis wants us to enter into relationships with our neighbours who are trapped in poverty and to listen to what God is saying to us through them. So the potential for the parish is significant, despite decline that's happening in parts of the country. The church is vulnerable. It needs friends. And sometimes I can't help thinking that God could be humbling the church so that in its poverty, it realizes that it needs to build a relationship with poor communities. So looking ahead, in the context of increasing global instability and the concentration of the powers of market and state, and massive public debt, times are likely to be hard. But there is a possibility for an inflection point for those churches who are willing to make the shift. Building genuine relationships with neighbours trapped in poverty is absolutely where the church needs to be. We will need each other, and this is how we begin to offer a resistance to the powers. So I'm going to be good and stop within my 12 minutes. I hope that's okay.
That's great, Jenny. Thank you for a very, very clear, impassioned, both sort of formal and informal personal perspective on those questions. The call for a kind of relational and structural renewal that puts reciprocity at the heart of any conversation about solutions to the reality of various forms of complex impoverishment. So thank you very much for that. We're going to move. So already, I hope that you have thoughts and views stimulated by Jenny's contribution. I cannot believe that didn't stimulate thoughts, comments, agreements, disagreements, matters for debate. So please be preparing those in the chat or noting them down for now, because Amanda will feed to me the questions in the chat as we go through, and then we can make good use of the time that we have at the end. But in the meantime, we're going to move to our second speaker, Patrick O'Dowd. So Patrick has been part of the Diocese of Salford, which was originally my home diocese many moons ago, since 2009. He joined Caritas Salford in 2020, becoming director in 2021. He has a bachelor's degree in theology, a master's in charity management, and has had the slightly unenviable task of steering Caritas Salford through the challenges of a pandemic and also the ongoing cost of living crisis. As the chair of the CSAM Migration Alliance, he supports a network of Catholic charities working to assist refugees and forcibly displaced persons, including efforts to combat modern slavery. So Patrick, we're in your hands.
Thanks, Anna. Thanks very much, everybody. And follow that, Patrick, I suppose, with Jenny. Thank you, Jenny. I hope to be able to build on some of the themes that you've raised there in the next few minutes. And I'm really grateful for the opportunity to join you to talk about one of the critical issues that affects people across the globe, and of course, right here in the UK, on the theme of poverty and its relationship to CST. Over the course of the next few minutes, I'd like to share a few experiences and insights based on our practical social action work delivered across Salford Diocese, which covers Greater Manchester and parts of East Lancashire, how these connect to the broader national situation and how they relate to the principles of Catholic social teaching. So over the past few years, we've heard a great deal about the signs of hardship all around us. Food bank use and the number of families living in temporary accommodation are at a record high. People having to depend on charities to be able to eat, stay warm, or keep themselves or their families washed and clean are tragically too common. This poverty is not merely a lack of material resources caused by such things as low income, insecure work, unaffordable accommodation, or the rising cost of living. But as John Kurt, one of the recent guests on Jenny's lectures, suggests, it's far more complex. Kurt highlights two additional but overlapping and interrelated forms of poverty: poverty of relationships and poverty of identity, which conspire to deepen the crisis and trauma that so many individuals and communities are facing right now in the UK. With the ties that bring families and communities together gradually more stretched, increasing isolation and loneliness, we see how an individual can become more separate from nurturing and sustaining relationships. And in Caritas Salford, we're witnessing daily how people have become more remote and disconnected. Further, there's an interrelated poverty of identity and how people see and value their own self-worth and purpose, giving rise to an increase in mental health difficulties and poor emotional well-being. It's in these three particular aspects that deny individuals and families the opportunity to live with dignity and to thrive that we at Caritas Salford and other Catholic social action agencies working to tackle poverty across England and Wales try to be attentive to in the practical work of supporting and accompanying people to transform their own lives from the trauma of poverty. As Anna mentioned, I was privileged to join Caritas Salford just over 4 years ago, shortly before the start of the COVID-19 pandemic. And with our various teams of staff and volunteers, I've encountered these related problems firsthand in the faces of people as I've witnessed increasing poverty and inequality in our communities. Many of you will have seen recently published data that shows the high levels of child poverty across England and Wales. In Salford, we believe this equates to over 333,000 children living in poverty, an increase of over 31,000 since last year, and in some areas, child poverty rates at a staggering 47% of the population. Tragically, this is no longer the exception, it's becoming the rule, and we estimate that 1 in 2 children in classrooms in our diocese are experiencing some form of poverty. This increase and the associated consequences are witnessed daily by our social workers and specialist schools and communities teams working with children and families. We've also seen an increase in the number of people coming forward for support in our community day centres. Many of them need access to basic essentials like the ability to shower or clean their clothes, because although they have a roof over their heads, they can't afford to top up their meter or cover the cost of hygiene products. One young mum was made homeless through a no-fault eviction with her 2 young children, aged 2 and 6. She couldn't afford the cost of private accommodation and found herself sofa surfing. With the challenge of the cost of childcare and lack of flexible employment, she presented at our food pantry to request support. There, she accessed additional housing advice, support in receiving social security benefits, and sufficient nutritious food to feed herself and her young children, and eventually was supported with family accommodation, furniture to be able to find a place of lasting safety for her and her family. Tragically, stories like these are a microcosm of a national crisis, and recent data shows around 14.5 million people in the UK live in poverty. 4.3 million of them are children, 1 in 6 of them are pensioners. The reasons are multifaceted: stagnant wages, rising living costs, caps on social security, and an inadequate safety net. The pandemic has only exacerbated these issues, pushing many who were previously just getting by into poverty. Data published in January 2024 relating to the full year of 2022 shows that 6 million people are in so-called very deep poverty, a situation that could have only worsened over the past 12 months. This is a problem described by the Joseph Browntree Foundation as a failure we pay for twice over. Firstly, the human cost of the indignity of poverty. Referring back to Kurt, people going without the essential resources strips them of their dignity, but also damages the opportunity for social connection and relationships. Living in a cold, damp home with no food damages physical health and increases social isolation. It heightens stigma and worsens mental health. Secondly, physical and mental health conditions increase the demand and costs for our NHS. People are unable to work due to long-term sickness, and local authorities spend more on temporary accommodation. School teachers find it challenging to teach children who are hungry and from damp and temporary homes. Moreover, in my view, there's actually a third and unknowable cost stemming from the lack of access to educational opportunities or for opportunities for genuine human development. How many artistic, social, cultural, and scientific advancements are lost due to the absence of creative individuals and groups hindered by poverty, preventing them from thriving and living life to the full? This must change, and it's something we can choose to change, and Catholic social teaching provides a comprehensive framework to help us address this moral, social, and economic irresponsibility and indifference towards human life and our natural world. It's a path to protect and promote the inherent dignity of every person. CST and the commitment to justice not only encompasses a profound concern for the inequalities that pervade our society, but advocates for reducing those disparities and promoting a more equitable world. There are obviously some widely known concepts of CST that immediately come to mind when considering the issues of poverty and social justice. The principle of human dignity, which underpins the Church's position against all forms of inequality, including poverty, is rightly put at the heart of discussion. The Church consistently teaches that any system or structure that diminishes the dignity of a person is unjust and must be reformed. This is further reinforced by the ethical imperative of the preferential option for those experiencing poverty, a demand for the prioritisation of the needs of those without the material resources that cause them disadvantage. And in Anna's book, Towards a Politics of Communion, she reminds us that Pope Francis has chosen the concept of the option for the poor and for the earth as the central focus of his increasing body of social teaching, as a way to reorientate our societies towards the common good. We also consider the principle of solidarity and the common good, which underscores our human interdependence, transcending individualism and promoting the recognition of our shared humanity, to be collaborators in working to build a society that serves all. Perhaps less familiar, but considered by many as a fundamental principle of CST, is the social teaching on the universal destination of goods. Rooted in scripture and a consistent theme in teaching since Rerum Novarum, this principle emphasises the moral obligation that everyone has to access to the use of the necessary resources to live a decent and dignified life. It's a crucial element to guiding efforts to alleviate poverty, advocates for a fair access to and use of resources and wealth to address the needs that are highlighted for those experiencing poverty and marginalisation. The Catechism reminds us that the goods of creation are destined for the entire human race. The challenge is obviously in applying these principles of the gospel and Catholic social teaching into practical action for the fair distribution of resources. And this involves for us as Catholics bringing our values into workplaces, whether public, charitable or private sector, and ensuring we're following moral principles, paying fair wages, offering fair hours and providing safe working conditions. Most importantly, I feel it requires those of us who are privileged not to be in a position of resource poverty to sensitively and appropriately engage in authentic human relationships with those experiencing the trauma of poverty. Though financial aid and volunteer work are vital, this must always go hand in hand with efforts to establish human relationships, breaking beyond social boundaries. Those relationships, we move beyond, through those relationships, move beyond mere charity to true solidarity. Poverty is a moral and social crisis that demands our attention right now, and addressing poverty requires a concerted effort from all aspects of society. And I believe that guided by the principles of CST, we can build a more just and equitable world, ensuring that every individual has the opportunity to flourish and live with dignity. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick. Brilliantly on time as well. That was really helpful and very striking and galvanizing reflection, which again, I hope that's now sifting in. We're beginning to build a narrative of a structural and relational integral approach to handling questions of poverty, to the sheer scale of the challenge that we face, the interconnectedness of the different aspects of a crisis around poverty, which both Jenny and Patrick's presentations have pointed out to us very clearly and strikingly. So we will move now to the northeast, to Father Chris Hughes, who I'm going to introduce in just a minute. And I think he's going to bring us in quite a focused way into the world around him in North Shields. So prepare for some immersion and to some of the kind of practical questions as well, in terms of ways in which, as part of community alliances, we can perhaps find some responses together to the reality that we're facing. So I'm just going to briefly introduce Chris and therefore suitably embarrass him. So Chris Hughes is a priest of the Diocese of Hexham and Newcastle, my now home diocese. He was ordained in 1987, but obviously doesn't look like he was, and has served in 3 parishes, his current appointment being in North Shields since 2015. He also has had a number of different chaplaincy roles, including schools, prisons, universities and hospitals. And I happen to know that he is also a much-loved spiritual director to many. He was on the staff of Ushaw College, as then was from 1999 to 2009, where he taught pastoral and practical theology. It was as a seminarian in the 1980s where he was inspired by CST and served 2 stints as chair of the Diocesan Justice and Peace Council. He's also on the leadership group of Tyne and Wear Citizens, which he's been involved with since 2016. So, Chris, we're very eager to hear from you.
Thanks, Anna, and thanks, Amanda, for your invitation. And I really appreciate the inputs from Jenny and Patrick about some of the, taking us deeper into some of the causes and impact of poverty. as Anna has said, I'm really going to talk a little bit about the context I'm in, very much on a local basis. And then some of the work that I've been doing with Tinyware citizens, especially because I think one aspect of poverty is a lack of power. Austin Smith talked very powerfully about powerlessness. And I will be talking later on about the importance of subsidiarity. So, because I think that really does matter a great deal in terms of how we address issues of poverty. So to say something of the context that I'm in North Shields. It's 2 churches, 1 parish. We have an estate here that got some kind of national focus 30 years ago. We had riots on the Meadowell estate, known as the Ridges, before then. And the Meadowell became kind of synonymous with poverty, deprivation, and crime. And when I arrived, the local community centre that I was a trustee of said that in terms of levels of income, that estate was in the bottom 0.3% of income. So yeah, great poverty in that estate. More recently, the North East Child Poverty Commission has said that in the area of the North East, 89% of constituencies in the North East, this is kind of data just published last month, at least 1 in 4 children are experiencing child poverty. And interesting, 67% of children in households of poverty are part of working families, because we're told that it's work that will get you out of poverty. Well, sadly, that isn't the case. Also, just from a local context, that's become a real issue is housing. We're next to some really nice parts, Whitley Bay, Tynemouth. My gut feeling is that kind of Airbnb has kind of taken a lot of those properties. So when I arrived, I had no junior doctors. I've now got 5, and I've had to have 5 people tell me they've had to leave the area because they can't afford the rent anymore. And even in the Meadowell, rents have gone up. We saw a house, £1,200 a month, a nice house, but £1,200 a month in the Meadowell, which for local people, they'll know that's kind of wow. A teacher told me that a parent said they had to move their kids from the school because they couldn't afford the rent in the Meadowell. And she says, where do you go when you can't afford to live in the Meadowell? That really chilled me, just hearing that fact. So there's some of the issues that we're facing in the North East. Community organising has meant a lot to me because I can see how it can bring about change. I'm going to refer to it simply as BBCO, and BBCO in 2 ways is broad-based. One is the diversity of organisations. So in Tinyware Citizens of 37 institutions, there's schools, universities, charities, community organisations, trade unions, mosques, and churches. I'm even told Durham Wildlife are negotiating about membership. It will be fascinating to have them on board. We're also broad-based because we're looking at a range of issues. In the campaigns that we've focused on, we've looked at low pay, mental health, rundown parks, road safety, litter, dog muck, misogyny, anti-racism, cheaper public transport. So a whole range of issues that we've addressed in the past 9 years. The methodology of BBCO is similar to See Judge Act and the pastoral cycle. I think what I find interesting is that those early parts of the cycle, that See Judge Act and the pastoral cycle, we place a lot of emphasis on building relationships, that we hear about the stories. We're encouraged to have what's called one-to-ones, where we have 40-minute conversations where we just don't talk about the weather, but we are interested to hear about people's key events, the key people in their lives, their hopes and fears, how they spend their time, their energy, and their money. And that's, you really get to know the person, and really realize you're dealing with sacred ground here. When you hear stories, you can't argue with stories. You can argue about ideas and concept, and philosophies, but you can't argue with the key experiences of people's lives. So the foundation is building relationships and having relational power that can make a difference. So just briefly, three campaigns that we've been involved in. The living wage, as some of you may know, came from East London citizens. It was the first big campaign, mainly people from churches and mosques saying that, yeah, they could afford the bills, but they didn't have enough time with their families because they were working silly hours. When we started in the Northeast, only 30 employers were paying the living wage. We're now up to 333, including key institutions like Newcastle University, Sunderland University, and culturally the most important organisation in the Tyneside, Newcastle United Football Club. So they're now paying the living wage. Interesting to note that of the 30 dioceses of England, Scotland, and Wales, only 7 have been accredited as living wage employers, and I think that's a really important issue that I think as a church we need to address. 2 campaigns from the school. One is that a group of teenagers were really upset that they had to pay adult bus fares from the age of 16. So they got together, decided, send an email to the bus company, ignored, 3 emails ignored. We had a relationship with the local mayor, North of Tyne Mayor, Jamie Driscoll. He brokered a conversation. They still weren't responsive to the need to pay cheaper fares for 16-year-olds. Eventually, we got a meeting. The kids turned up in their parents' work clothes to say, "Look, don't we look silly?" And they had a conversation, and that started more conversations with local governments, with levelling up departments, and other transport companies. And it was great that a year ago it was announced that everyone under the age of 22 would only pay £1 each time they got on the bus, and that was helping 23,000 young people. So just great success of what can be achieved. And the other issue, and again, you can presume what the issues are when we started. I was surprised to hear that mental health was the biggest concern that people had. And that was a concern for our young people in the school, poor GP referrals. The place they went to for their CAMs was like a prison. They actually used the same paint that's used in prisons. They were able to get a conversation with the local trust chair, and he said, "Okay, I hear you. Here's 40,000 quid, and you can redesign your CAMS clinic." Again, what it did to their young people and their mental health, their sense of achievement, and wow, this is what we can do. It was just wonderful to see. But then they realized, look, people are on CAMS waiting list for 18 months. When you're 14, that's a long time. So they felt the needs that there should be a counsellor in every school, which isn't an obligation in England, but it has been in Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland. So a long campaign, but we were delighted that when we met with Alan Campbell, who's now the Chief Whip, who's the local MP, he pledged £250 million a year so that every school in the country would have a counsellor. And I think just that sense of, wow, again, what can be achieved? And he said, not many schools can say they've actually had an impact on national policy. So it's just great to see what can achieve and their sense of self-worth. I mean, some of you at the conference at the weekend, Justin Pearson's, one of our young people came, Sunish, Chantal Shanish, and she was inspiring, and her sense of worth and achievement. So how does this link to teaching of the church? Well, first of all, interesting how I talked about the living wage. One of the key concerns was family, family and marriage life. It's an important aspect. But if you're poor, then that will be impacted. People want to spend time with their loved ones. So it was just interesting to know that. And I also note that one organisation campaigning to scrap the 2-child cap is SPUC. They realise it's a pro-life issue. So I'm fascinated how issues that are not often seen as part of CST, but wider church tradition are also linked, that all things are connected, as Pope Francis tells us. the common good clearly has been mentioned before. You know, whose voices are not being heard, and I would say that not all voices are heard in the work that we do. I mean, we haven't got a prison who's a member of our alliance. We haven't got an organisation with people with learning disability voices, but we are hearing some. Also, it's a reminder that let's not presume what the needs of people. Let's hear them and discover what they are, and that comes through our relationships. I was struck with what Helen Alford said last week about a spiritual aspect of the common good is being in relationship. And I find those relationships are really important. You really discover the worth of other people and build and see what can be done. It's just been a joy to be involved in. And obviously the dignity of the human person. Low pay, when you've got to make choices between eating or heating, when you've got to work ridiculous hours and you haven't got time to spend with loved ones, yeah, that affects dignity. And also we clearly see the impact it has on people's mental health. So for me, again, the dignity of people has been come across through the relationships that we've had with people. And also it's just great to see people, especially young people, flourish. Dignity isn't something that simply you protect. You want it to develop and grow. And I've seen that in our young people, and it's just amazing. Finally,
60 seconds.
60 seconds. Finally, it's really that the issue of subsidiarity, about power being at the right level. But interesting how small groups of people have been able to affect national policy. Someone said to me, their bishop said, you know, it's up to bishops to speak at a kind of at national level to governments. But I realized that actually power can actually work at local level, but can transcend local levels and make an impact on national policy. And I think that's really that's great to see. So yeah, subsidiarity I think can be really important, because power at a local level can make a huge difference, which has been a joy to see in my work. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. That's a really helpful contribution and kind of brings some diversity of perspective and location as well to the comments from the others. So we've got some time now, 20 minutes, just under, for questions and discussion. We've already got a couple in the chat. I hope that there's more to come, but I'm going to start with the questions that are in the chat, seeing as we've got two already. So I'm going to start with Kath's question first. And I think all of you can say something to this. It's picking up on Jenny's comment at the beginning about a kind of fear of the complexity of people's lives. But I think if I ask each of you to speak just briefly for a minute on this. So Kath asks, Jenny spoke of parishioners being scared of the complexity of local families experiencing poverty and this being a barrier to encounter and support. How can we take away this fear at parish level, especially where knowledge of Catholic social teaching and what it asks of us is often limited? Jenny, seeing as the comment came from you in the first place, I'll give you the first chance to reply, and then I'll come to Chris and then to Patrick.
Yeah, so it's a great question. I think that there's definitely a need for some resourcing and some training for volunteers. We can't expect ordinary parishioners to be able to step up with complex needs, right? But I think it's important, again, with subsidiarity here, what is reasonable for a parishioner or body of parishioners to deal with, and what isn't, and where do they need the additional help from organisations like Patrick's, for example, in the local. So I think it's a matter for a parish to discern. Actually, I think it's where synodality is very important here. Questions like, who are we as a people in relationship with this place, this neighbourhood, and who are our neighbours? Who are the people that we don't know, that we do know, people we want to help, who perhaps are not engaged with the church? These kinds of questions are really helpful. And then there will always be somebody in the parish, in the body of the congregation, who will have a connection. So it's a sense of like, how do we build those relationships? And then how do we equip ourselves to be able to handle difficult situations? So I think it's more, what I said earlier might have sounded a little harsh, but it is true. People tell me this all the time. People often say privately, well, we're helping refugees because we've got support to do that and we're part of the structure. but we're actually afraid of dysfunctional families down the road because we don't know what to do. So this is a real problem because they are actually our neighbours, and this estrangement often has a class element to it as well.
Interestingly, Jenny, just quickly on that, this is not just a British problem. Interestingly, this is a key feedback from the synodal reports from around the world. Pope Francis asked that synodal listening had a preferential option for those on the peripheries and the margins. And most of the continents of the world wrote back and said, we know we were meant to do this. It's really hard. We don't find it easy to do. And we often find ourselves feeling very empty-handed and de-skilled in knowing how to do this. So it's really interesting that it's a reality, I think, for every parish. And it's a reality that kind of reverberates across the globe. Chris.
Thanks, Anna. My sense is first of all, people can be incredibly generous, and are willing to give, but their ability to, what's the causing of these issues, to try and help people to find, and again to be discerning and discover, well, you can't change everything, but are there local issues that we can make a difference, and also be discerning. Actually, can you make an impact? And one of the questions we ask in organising is it winnable? If it's not winnable, then you can't do anything about it. So really listen to people, see what the issues are, see what the causes are, and then discern, can we make a difference? So do the power analysis. Who's got the power? Can you make an impact? And all I can say is that I've seen people be able to make a difference on the local level.
So just to chip in on the end of what Chris is saying with a comment from Martin, and then I'm going to come to Patrick. Martin says, start conversations with strangers to encourage solidarity, banishing isolation and allowing others to voice their experience. He says, I do this on buses. It can introduce new friends to our churches too. Patrick.
And my wife would absolutely agree with that, Martin, because I have this terrible habit that sometimes delays us whenever we go anywhere, because I start chatting to ask them questions and strike up a conversation. I absolutely agree with the point about perhaps the fear. And when I first went into some centres in the past, it can be quite chaotic and something from the norm of what many of us might expect in our daily lives. So I think we have to accept and acknowledge that. From some of the synodal listening that we did in our services, meeting people and the feedback that we got that we fed into the diocesan process was this resonating phrase that kept coming through about suspending judgment. And I thought it was a really, really important point. We all do it, but we have to start on a process of formation ourselves and look at our own prejudice, bias, and then be accompanied on that process through the point made before about education. I think there's a really good scheme from the Northeast that's now moving across the schools, in particular around poverty proofing. I think that as a measure to start the discussion about some of the stigma about relationships and poverty is a really good way of giving you a huge jolt in the arm to say, these are some things that we'd never even considered before. And then when you started that education, I think, again, it's about entering into a relationship. There's things like poverty truth commissions that I think are really good, well structured. We need to be safe. We need to safeguard people. We need to not re-traumatize people. I talk a lot about the trauma of poverty. So I think that there's that, and people sometimes need to be accompanied to have the confidence, the skill. But all that said, sometimes it just takes a little bit of inspiration to move on, a little bit of accompaniment. And I think starting with formation, building some shared activities. And I suppose a final point, or two final points quickly, is around there's plenty of people in parishes that do this every day through their professional lives, like nurses and doctors and teachers. And also, I think there's something to be said for clergy as well. Many of them have got lots of skill in doing this. Many of them don't. So what can we do to support them? We're blessed with a group of religious, very dynamic religious sisters in our diocese who've led the way on this, and I think sometimes good to get them involved in supporting people too. Hope that's
Thank you. That's really helpful. Interestingly, again, from a synod perspective, one of the things in the working document to be discussed this October is whether the church should recognise a ministry of listening and accompaniment in local parishes, which is not to say that's then not the job of priests or deacons or religious in parishes, but should there be a specific ministry, a dedicated ministry of listening and accompaniment? I think that's a really interesting fruit of the synodal process. And there's both, and I'm just looking at the questions coming up, and I'm really struck by this dual thing the church has to do all the time when it's thinking about poverty issues. There's the gratuitousness of the life of a Christian community, where it simply has the capacity to be fools for Christ, to waste time, to give time away, to spend time with others without there being a winnable end to it, without there being a necessary solution, but simply the gift of being, as it were, and the formation of those relationships of family, of being sisters and brothers, and really that being a meaningful thing. Jenny was using that language and the others have as well, at the same time as saying that there are structural winnable points, as it were, that when we're in alliance with others we can focus on, and we're kind of constantly in this kind of dual citizenship, as it were, of the world and of the city of God simultaneously. So I'm going to read out a question from Val along those lines, which she put earlier. So when we talk about poverty, it can feel overwhelming and too big to tackle. Today I was listening to a HIF project to the issues parents, carers and children would like to see changed. They wanted more accessible, safe and affordable places for their kids. These are things we can work on together. We need to break poverty down to winnable changes. And then she says, just another comment, I'm going to assume it's the same, Val. We also need to recognise the chaos in many of our lives. My children live on low income and precarious work. They would not like being referred to as the poor, but without parents around them, they would be. This is the same for many in our pews. Pat, I'm going to reverse the order and come to Patrick on Val's two comments, and then I'll do Chris and then Jenny.
Thank you. First of all, I referred already, Val, to the point about chaos. It can be quite chaotic. I think there is a point about language, and I think we need to look at that. Obviously, we've got a scriptural language, biblical language talking about the poor, but we need to perhaps look at that in our practical work of engaging with people and try and look at destigmatizing language and come up with things around that. In terms of the breaking poverty down to winnable changes, I think you're absolutely right. And again, scripture has got a really good example of this in the Good Samaritan, of just doing one thing at a time and just entering into relationship with people. And it is sometimes just the very simple, very practical things. I'm a big fan of a strategic plan, but actually, building on Anna's point before, the church does have the space to be able to accompany people for the long term, to support people that are there. So I think that that's space to be done, but we need to have some formation again to help do that, because perhaps we've lost our confidence a little bit about how we're able to engage with people, and we've become a bit boundaried.
In a minute, there's another question on that theme. Chris.
Yeah, I agree with what Patrick says about the importance of language. We mustn't destigmatize. Again, I think encountering with people, the labels get removed. You're just dealing with people and discover their beauty, their worth, and their dignity. Yes, it has to be kind of winnable issues, and let's go behind the causes. I've actually did a reflection on the Good Samaritan. What would it like if actually we did some one-to-ones with the characters in the story? You know, why were people going into robbing and beating up people? How did the person feel on the road being beat up? You know, again, if we speak to people and get hear their stories and then look for the causes, that can be a way forward. But yeah, we have to be practical. And one of the other things I've learned, that protest doesn't get you far. Protest is not it's basically inadequate. Seeking winnable change is what matters.
I was struck by a conversation with Timothy Ratcliffe recently. We were talking about discernment, and I had to give a talk on discernment and the role of bishops in discernment. And Timothy said to me, I think you should say, this wasn't British bishops, I think you should say, go back to the Jesus of the Gospels. How does Jesus approach people? How does he begin to have conversations? He begins by asking people, what do you ask of me? What do you need? So there's a kind of rather beautiful kind of sense of relationship and allowing people to speak for themselves of their needs and seeing what kind of gift can be made and exchange in response. Jenny.
Yeah, thanks. Regarding this ministry of listening and accompaniment, I just want to witness that I'm coming across this in across different denominations and traditions. This is where the Holy Spirit is already working, right? So, for example, I know a pastor in South London who has been running a kind of, he calls it a food stop. It's a bit like a social supermarket. And he's finding that the people that come there want to be there. There's a kind of a magnet that's drawing them there. They want to be there because they're being listened to. And it's a place where they're being ministered to. But they're not coming into church, but they're coming into the food supermarket. And this is often where ministry takes place. And there is now some stories of traffic going from the supermarket into people coming to baptism. So it does work in terms of evangelization as well. That's the first thing I want to say. The second is this issue of overwhelm. One of the questions mentioned that word. And this is such a big deal. The scale of need now is so great because the economy is so broken that we've not seen anything like this before. My friends in Christians Against Poverty, the debt counselling charity, National Debt Counselling Charity, are saying for the first time in their history, they're seeing over 50% of their clients now have broken budgets. That means no matter how much help they give them, they can't make things balance. And that's because they're not being paid enough, right? So that leads me on to, I just wanted to say also about that sense of overwhelm, that people, when they're volunteering, and very well-meaning people in churches really want to help, we mustn't fall into the trap of this idolatry of thinking of ourselves as the rescuer. We are not the rescuer. Christ is the rescuer. We can only accompany people, and maybe we all go down together. I think that's the point, is the solidarity. I just want to say something as well about destigmatizing language. I think we've got to be very careful here that if we do that, we stop actually naming the problem. People are poor. They are not being paid enough. We've got a low wage, high welfare economy. It doesn't work. It's dangerous. It's hurting people. So if we say, oh, we mustn't use the word poor because people don't like it, well, okay, how else do we talk about it? Be very careful that we're not masking prophetic justice here. This is actually the church's biggest calling, is to say the prophetic unwelcome things that is difficult to say. So just a word of caution there. But yeah.
Chris, yes, sorry, Jenny. Chris, I think you wanted to intervene on that quickly.
Yeah, I think it's a bit like when we talk about prisoners. No, there are people in prison, so it's not the poor, it's people who are poor.
Well, I love Frank Field's phrase, people trapped in poverty.
Yeah.
The phrase that we've used, interestingly, in the synod documents, in the most recent ones, is people made poor. Which I think also has some, and we've wrestled with the same question around terminology. It's really difficult for all those reasons. Yeah. Okay, because we're coming up to time, I'm going to just ask, and this will be a sort of very quick response from each of you because we need to allow time just to conclude. But Sue asks, how do you deal with getting people to talk to those they don't know when there are so many warnings of dangers of so doing, along with all the dangers for women in particular? I'm London based, so perhaps it's not an issue in other places. Well, I mean, I think the question does arise in other places. Patrick?
I think it's quite complex in many regards. I think that, again, it goes back to preparation and also about the environment. So people might be more open to speaking to other people in a certain environment. So, for example, if they feel like they've got something to give in that volunteering element, maybe they could sign up. This is a plug for the whole network here, for the Caritas Social Action Network as a volunteer. And our agencies have frameworks to be able to welcome you, support you, and enable you. And it takes time as well. I think we need to walk with people who are in that position for the long term as well, because there might be other underlying issues of why they're feeling that lack of confidence. But I think find a safe environment for that to happen. It's not walking around the streets of London at night. I don't think. It might be in a day centre or a support centre operated by a Catholic charity in England and Wales.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to allow that one to stand just because of the time, and I'm going to give each of our contributors a sort of 30-second final thought that you would want to offer in the light of the conversation that we've had. And to give you 10 seconds to think about it, I'm going to read Martin's comment, which is a kind of lovely summary comment from the chat. He's quoting Simone Weil. He says, generosity, well, she says, and he says, generosity is the greatest form of attention. People need affirmation by being encouraged to talk about their reality. Chris, a final 30-second thought.
Issues are complex. They're huge. What Jenny says, it's broken. Let's see what we can do. And we can make a difference.
Yeah, thank you. Jenny?
We need to make a shift from handouts to a hand up and look for every opportunity to become an occasion for communion, and recognize that ministry is not just in a church. It could be on a bus. It could be in the social supermarket. Churches should, I think, take time to discern who they are as a people in relationship with a place, and listen to the Holy Spirit about how they are called to engage with people. It'll be different in every place.
Very good. Third section of the Instrumentum Laboris, people in places. Very good. Patrick?
People are oftentimes broken and traumatized, and I think that lots of aspects of society and individuals need healing, but we need to be brave doing that and be inspired by the Holy Spirit to do that. We need to follow that path of suspending judgment, and I endorse the comments made both by Jenny and Chris in that regard too. So quick answer.
Yeah, but profound and to the point. Thank you to all three of our speakers, to those of you who've offered comments, reflections and questions this evening. I think we've had a wide-ranging and challenging discussion in the time that we've had available. So just before I hand back to Amanda, if we can give a virtual or actual round of applause to our speakers to say thank you to them. And saying thank you to Amanda and the Tablet for organising this evening, I'm now going to hand back to Amanda.
Thank you very much. I think because in the light of the discussion, I'm not going to go through my usual slides. I think I just wanted to leave on some of the words that Father Chris said. We think about people and their beauty, their worth and their dignity. On behalf of myself and the Tablet and the panel, I'd like to wish you a very good evening. Good night.
No.